The palace gates have seen centuries of scandal, betrayal, and heartbreak, but nothing like this. In the quiet of a California morning, thousands of miles from the royal residence he once called home, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, the king's youngest son, was reportedly found collapsed on the floor of his Montecito mansion. Emergency services were called, neighbors alerted, and within minutes, flashing lights surrounded the luxury estate. The story spread like wildfire. But what triggered it wasn't an accident or a medical mystery. It was something much deeper. Something royal insiders claim has been building for years. A heartbreak that finally reached its breaking point. Because just hours before that terrifying moment, Buckingham Palace had issued a statement that stunned the world. A statement so final, so cold, that it shattered what was left of the bond between father and son. According to palace sources, King Charles III had made his most devastating decision yet, to strip Prince Harry of all remaining royal titles and privileges. To remove him not only from the royal fold, but from the monarchy's history books altogether. Officially, irrevocably, permanently. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But that's not all. What followed in those next hours, the phone calls, the reactions, the cover-ups, painted a far darker picture than the headlines dared to show. Because according to people close to the Sussex circle, this wasn't just a royal decision. It was personal. It was punishment. And for Harry, it was the moment everything, his health, his faith, even his identity, began to unravel. Let's take a step back. Because this story didn't begin with a statement, it began with silence. Weeks of it. While rumors swirled about a pending royal restructuring, few imagined it would end with the king disowning his own son. But those inside the palace say the warning signs were there. Meetings behind closed doors. Advisors leaving Windsor Castle late into the night. Legal drafts passing through confidential channels. Something big was coming. And yet, somehow, Harry never saw it. Maybe he didn't want to. Because for months, there'd been talk of reconciliation, of bridges being rebuilt. Harry had reportedly reached out quietly to his father, hoping for a thaw in the frosty relationship. Insiders claimed he'd even written a private letter, expressing remorse over past interviews and misunderstandings. To the public, it looked like progress. But behind the scenes, the royal machinery was moving in a very different direction. So what really pushed King Charles to the edge? Why now, after years of strained relations, did he decide to erase Harry from royal life completely? According to sources close to royal advisors, it wasn't just one event. It was accumulation. A pattern of defiance, public embarrassment, and perceived betrayal that reached a point of no return. And as the final papers were being prepared, one advisor allegedly said, "The king no longer sees this as a family issue. He sees it as a constitutional one." Constitutional. That single word changed everything. Because once the matter left the realm of family and entered the domain of state, emotion no longer mattered. Tradition did. Reputation did. And for Charles, who'd waited his entire life for the throne, one scandal too many could threaten the stability of his reign. But for Harry, who had already given up so much, his home, his military honors, his public duties, this final blow was too much to bear. Those close to him describe a man torn between anger and despair. He felt blindsided. He believed the palace had deliberately kept him in the dark until it was too late to respond. And when he finally saw the official statement, reportedly shared with him hours before it went public, his world crumbled. The statement itself was short, almost surgical in its wording. His Majesty the King, with the advice of his Privy Council, has determined that His Royal Highness Prince Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, shall no longer hold nor exercise any royal title, style, or privilege, effective immediately. That was it. No warmth, no sentiment, no sign of the father behind the crown. To Harry, it read like an obituary of his royal life. To the world, it was history repeating itself, another royal exile, another family fracture under the British crown. But what came next no one expected. Within minutes of reading the message, Meghan reportedly called close friends in tears, saying Harry had gone pale and wasn't responding to her voice. He'd been under immense pressure for weeks, she told them, barely sleeping, constantly checking his phone for updates from the palace, fearing the worst but hoping for the best. The final blow had come too fast, too cold, and too cruel. Paramedics arrived shortly after, treating what sources describe as a stress-induced collapse. While initial reports ruled out any major cardiac incident, doctors emphasized that severe emotional distress can have real, physical consequences. And yet, as heartbreaking as this scene sounds, insiders say it's only the beginning of a much larger royal storm. Because what's emerging now, leaked memos, text exchanges, private witness accounts, suggest this decision wasn't spontaneous at all. It was strategic, planned, some say orchestrated months in advance. And according to one insider, the final decision was sealed the day after Harry rejected a private royal offer. What was that offer? What did Harry refuse? And why did it lead to this? For King Charles, sources claim the decision came with great sadness but firm resolve. He had tried, in his words, to protect the monarchy's dignity. But there's a growing whisper inside royal circles that this wasn't just about dignity, it was about dominance. The crown couldn't afford to appear weak in the face of defiance, especially from within its own bloodline. The Sussex saga, they say, had become a symbol of rebellion. And for Charles, rebellion had to end. But let's pause here and ask, at what cost? What does it mean when a father chooses his crown over his child? Is it duty or betrayal? These are questions even royal historians are struggling to answer. Because if Charles's reign was meant to be the era of unity, compassion, and modernization, this moment has shattered that illusion. The image of a son lying unconscious while his father's official decree dominates headlines. It's haunting. It's Shakespearean. It's tragic. And yet, beneath all the headlines, something even darker is brewing. Insiders claim that this royal disownment wasn't just about family conflict. It was triggered by something Harry never saw coming. A revelation. A report. A private investigation that had reached the king's desk only days earlier. The content of that report, say those familiar with it, could forever alter the royal narrative. Something about Harry's conduct, alliances, and confidential dealings that crossed an invisible line. Some whisper it ties back to international engagements. Others say it's personal, a matter involving trust and security. Whatever it is, those close to the king say it broke the final thread of patience. And here's where the contradictions begin to emerge. Because even as the palace insists this was a decision made in accordance with royal protocol, others suggest it was an act of pure emotion, revenge cloaked in formality. Meghan, insiders claim, begged Harry to respond publicly, to fight back. But at that moment, he couldn't. The man who once stood tall as a decorated soldier, husband, and father was now facing the unimaginable, royal erasure. Media coverage exploded instantly. Morning shows debated whether this was justice or cruelty. Some commentators praised the king's decisiveness. Others called it heartless. Across social media, hashtags like #PrayForHarry and #RoyalDisownment began trending within minutes. Supporters flooded his charity page with messages of love, while critics questioned his decisions over the past few years. But none of it mattered to Harry. At that moment, he was in a hospital bed, disconnected from the world, hooked to monitors, his future uncertain. And while he lay recovering, the palace continued business as usual. No personal statement from the king. No visit. No message of concern. Just silence. Cold, deafening silence. For royal watchers, it was chilling proof that the monarchy had crossed a moral line. For Harry's supporters, it was a declaration of war. And yet, even then, the full truth of what had driven Charles's decision remained hidden. That's what this exposé seeks to uncover. Because behind this royal fallout lies a sequence of decisions, manipulations, and betrayals that go far beyond a father and son. It involves senior advisors, rival factions, and secret communications that have never seen daylight. And as we piece together the timeline, one thing becomes clear: Harry's collapse wasn't random. It was the inevitable result of months, maybe years, of pressure orchestrated behind palace walls. So, what exactly was in the confidential report that reached King Charles's desk days before the announcement? Who pushed for this final decision? Was it the king's idea alone, or was someone else pulling the strings behind the throne? In the chapters ahead, we'll unravel the unseen chain of events, the hidden motives, and the emotional fallout that led to one of the most shocking royal decisions of our time. Because this isn't just a story about titles. It's a story about power, about control, about a family so consumed by image that it's willing to destroy its own to preserve it. And if sources are correct, the king's move to strip his son of everything wasn't the end of the punishment. It was only the beginning. But the question that haunts everyone now is simple. Will Harry ever recover from the betrayal, from the collapse, from being erased by the very institution he was born to serve? It happened in seconds. One moment, Montecito was quiet, sunlight spilling through the palm-lined streets, birdsong weaving through the calm. The next, chaos. Sirens. Shouts. The unmistakable urgency of panic. Prince Harry has collapsed. The call to emergency services began. He's not responding. We need help now. But what could bring a 40-year-old former soldier, fit, disciplined, hardened by combat, to his knees? What could break a man who once stood unflinching against the glare of the world's cameras? Insiders say it wasn't illness. It wasn't exhaustion. It was heartbreak. A collapse not of the body, but of the spirit. Because just hours before, that cold, emotionless statement from Buckingham Palace had hit global airwaves. The one that stripped him of everything, titles, privileges, even his royal identity. A statement that effectively said, "You are no longer one of us." Imagine hearing that from your own father. Imagine the silence that follows, the heavy, suffocating kind that wraps around your chest and doesn't let go. Harry didn't see it coming. Not like this. He had believed, perhaps foolishly, that despite everything, Charles would never make it official. That words said in anger, in interviews, in private letters could eventually be forgiven. He'd been wrong. Reports say Harry had been alone in the study when the news alert flashed across his phone. Meghan was upstairs with the children. The words, cold and clinical, appeared like a knife through glass. By order of His Majesty King Charles III, something inside him gave way. He didn't shout, didn't cry. He just froze. Minutes passed before Meghan found him, motionless, the phone still clutched in his hand. She shouted his name, once, twice, no response. Panic set in. The staff rushed to call 911. And as paramedics arrived, with flashing lights cutting through the Montecito calm, one question echoed among everyone present. What could possibly drive him this far? Because this wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was premeditated. Those close to the palace say King Charles had signed the final documents 3 days prior. The statement had been drafted, approved, and locked into the release schedule. Harry was not informed. No courtesy call, no warning. And yet, some whisper that wasn't the king's decision alone. Rumors swirl that a royal council, led by senior advisors, had pressured Charles into finalizing it after receiving what's now being described as a confidential internal assessment. A document so explosive it could tarnish the monarchy's standing if left unchecked. But here's the twist. Those close to Harry claim he had no idea such a report even existed. So when the world read those icy words, Harry was reading them for the first time too. By the king's command. Just 4 words. 4 words that broke a lifetime of loyalty. And yet, here's the contradiction. Harry had once said he left the royal family to protect his mental health, to escape the institution's cold machinery. But even outside it, that same machinery found him. The palace's shadow is long, and it reached all the way to California. Neighbors later told reporters that the sound of sirens felt unreal. It was like watching a scene from a movie, one said. You never think royalty and tragedy live next door, until they do. But behind the flashing lights, Meghan's desperation painted a different picture. Witnesses described her crying out, "He's not breathing right, please hurry," while clutching his hand. Doctors would later confirm he suffered what they called an acute stress collapse, a physical manifestation of emotional trauma. A polite medical phrase for something far more human. A man finally breaking under years of pressure, grief, and betrayal. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just about losing titles. This was about losing belonging. Ever since Diana's death, Harry had clung to one fragile truth, that despite everything, his family was still his anchor. That no matter how wide the ocean between them, blood remained thicker than tabloids. But that belief had just been shattered. And what makes it even more haunting? The statement, reportedly signed at Clarence House, had been scheduled for release precisely 24 hours before Harry's planned charity event in Los Angeles, a deliberate timing that sources describe as strategic. Think about that. A global public humiliation strategically released on the eve of one of his few remaining professional appearances. Coincidence or calculation? Royal watchers say it's part of a pattern. Every major milestone Harry's had in recent years, book releases, documentaries, public events, has been shadowed by palace counteractions. Coincidental timing or deliberate reminders of royal power. This one, though, hit different. Because this time, the crown didn't just counter Harry. It crushed him. As news of his hospitalization broke, royal reporters flooded Montecito. Helicopters hovered overhead, paparazzi lined the streets, and yet, Buckingham Palace remained silent. No statement of concern. No acknowledgement. That silence spoke louder than any words could. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. According to insiders close to the royal household, the decision to disown Harry had not only been approved, it had been celebrated by certain circles within the palace. Yes, celebrated. One unnamed aide was allegedly overheard saying, "At last, it's done. The crown is clean again." Clean. That word hit like a dagger. Because if the monarchy was now clean, what did that make Harry? A stain? A liability? A son erased from his lineage to preserve an image? Even now, as you listen to this, you can feel the tension between image and humanity, the battle between institution and blood. So why now? Why strip him publicly, knowing the emotional toll it could take? The answer, according to sources, lies in a hidden catalyst. A few days before the announcement, King Charles had reportedly received a confidential memorandum from a government liaison, a report involving financial missteps and questionable partnerships linked to a Sussex-affiliated initiative. Whether those claims held truth or were exaggerated remains unclear. But for the king, it was enough. Enough to finalize what he'd postponed for nearly a year. For Harry, it was betrayal on every level. Because if such allegations existed, he hadn't even been given the chance to defend himself. No hearing, no discussion, just exile. And while this was unfolding, Harry's team was blindsided. His representatives reportedly learned about the decision from journalists. Meghan, described by one insider as visibly shaking, made frantic calls to the palace, demanding answers. None came. Instead, hours later, another royal communiqué was issued, this time confirming that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex remain private citizens. The phrasing, subtle yet final, stripped away even their honorary military and charitable ties. Harry's supporters were outraged. Veterans called it disrespectful. Charity organizers were stunned. How could a man who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who built the Invictus Games to honor wounded soldiers, be erased like this? But here's the contradiction again. Even in anger, the palace insisted this was in accordance with tradition. Tradition, the same justification used for centuries to mask cruelty behind ceremony. And if you look closely, every royal scandal follows the same pattern: deny, deflect, discard. But this time, the discarded was the king's own son. At the hospital, doctors described Harry's condition as stable but fragile. His vitals improved within hours, but his mind, his spirit, was another matter. Close friends say he was quiet, detached, staring blankly at the wall. Meghan, ever protective, shielded him from the press, refusing to answer questions. But something changed in her eyes that day, witnesses say, a look of fear. Because for the first time, she realized the monarchy wasn't just distant. It was dangerous. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, London tabloids spun their narrative: Harry's collapse, a consequence of rebellion. Some even mocked his condition, calling it self-inflicted stress. The cruelty was astounding. The irony, unbearable. But among all the noise, one question kept rising from the public. Was this truly necessary? Did King Charles, a father already scarred by loss, need to destroy his last emotional bridge? Royal insiders insist the king was visibly distressed before the decision, pacing in private quarters, burdened by what one aide described as the heaviest heart. But emotion did not stop the pen. The statement went out. The silence remained. And yet, what no one knew at that moment was that another letter had already been written, a personal one, from King Charles to his son. Sources claim it was drafted days before the official announcement, but never delivered. It remains locked away in a drawer at Clarence House. Its contents? Unknown. But one aide whispered, it wasn't cold. It was a father's goodbye. If that's true, then the cruelty of fate is staggering. Because while the world dissected the politics of the crown, Harry never received the one message that might have saved him from breaking. Back in California, Meghan reportedly made a private vow to protect her husband from further royal harm. But what she didn't know was that this royal war was far from over. Because even as Harry lay recovering, the palace was preparing its next move, an internal review to formally adjust the line of succession. A bureaucratic phrase hiding a brutal truth. Harry's name would soon be gone from royal documents altogether. The process, once ceremonial, had become surgical. The monarchy was amputating its wounded limb. And yet, here's where things take a twist no one saw coming. Hours before the official succession change was due to be finalized, a leak occurred. A royal aide anonymously contacted a journalist, hinting that the king's decision wasn't entirely his own. That one statement sent shockwaves through the media. If Charles wasn't acting alone, then who was behind it? Who had the power to influence the monarch's most personal decision? Whispers began pointing fingers toward the queen consort circle, toward senior courtiers, even toward William himself. Each possibility darker than the last. And while speculation grew, so did public sympathy for Harry. Because even those who had criticized him before now saw a man broken, not by rebellion, but by rejection. As doctors prepared to discharge him, one journalist shouted a question from outside the hospital gates. "Prince Harry, will you respond to your father's decision?" He didn't answer. He just stared, eyes heavy, voice hoarse, and whispered something too quiet for the microphones to catch. But one nurse later said she heard it. He said, "I'm not his anymore." It was that line that froze everyone who heard it. Not as a statement of defiance, but of surrender. Because in that moment, the son of a king had become a man without a country, without a family, without a name. And yet, the story was only just beginning. Because while Harry tried to heal in silence, the world was about to learn that this royal disownment had roots far deeper than anyone realized. Documents, conversations, secrets buried under years of royal protocol. And one particular letter, sent not from Buckingham Palace, but from a private royal advisor, would soon resurface, changing everything we thought we knew about the king's decision. It began with an envelope. Cream paper, the kind that looks like it belongs in a museum. Thick, embossed with the royal crest in deep red wax. No name on the front, just a single phrase stamped in bold ink. Private, for Prince Harry only. Strange, isn't it? How something as small as an envelope can carry the weight of a dynasty. How a folded piece of paper could become the spark that burns through generations of silence. When Meghan found it, it was late, past midnight. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the Pacific and the faint glow of a single lamp still burning in Harry's study. She had gone in to check on him. He hadn't been sleeping since the hospital discharge. She thought he was dozing on the couch. Instead, she found him sitting perfectly still, staring at the sealed envelope on the desk, as if afraid to touch it. "Harry," she whispered. He didn't look up. No one knew how it got there. The staff swore no one had delivered anything. Security footage, as far as we know, showed nothing unusual. And yet, there it was. A royal letter in Montecito. The impossible sitting in plain sight. Was it sent officially? Was it smuggled out? Some royal correspondents speculate it came through diplomatic channels. A quiet favor from a sympathetic aide. Others think it wasn't supposed to reach him at all. But one thing is certain. Someone wanted him to read it. For nearly an hour, Harry sat in silence. He'd seen that kind of envelope before, hundreds of times, in another life. Official communications from the palace were always sealed the same way. But this one felt different. There was something off. Something personal. He turned it over in his hands. Then finally, he broke the wax seal. The air seemed to change. The sound of the paper tearing felt louder than it should have been. Meghan stepped closer, watching as he unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting, unmistakable. It wasn't typed. It wasn't drafted by a secretary. It was written by hand. And according to one insider who later claimed to have seen a photograph of it, the first line read simply, "My son, I did what I had to do." That was enough to make Harry stop breathing for a moment. He knew that script. He'd memorized it as a child, reading his father's birthday cards and Christmas notes. But this wasn't a message of affection. It was an explanation, perhaps even a justification. The letter went on for several paragraphs. Sources say, outlining the king's reasoning. How recent discoveries had left him with no choice. How advisors had warned him that allowing certain associations to continue under the royal banner posed risks to the crown's credibility. It was filled with formalities and regret, but laced with finality. And near the end came the line that reportedly shattered him. In my duty to the crown, I must let you go. Duty. Always duty. The word that had haunted his entire life. It was never love, never understanding. Always duty. And in that moment, the walls between father and son, already cracked and fragile, finally caved in. But here's the part no one expected. The letter didn't end there. It included something else, something that turned this from a tragedy into a mystery. Folded inside was a second sheet, bearing an entirely different handwriting. Firmer, straighter, almost militaristic. It wasn't from Charles. It was signed only with initials. 3 letters. Carr. At first glance, they meant nothing. But within the palace, those initials carried weight. Some believe they belonged to Clive A. Renshaw, a senior advisor with decades of influence in royal crisis management. The man often referred to behind closed doors as the crown's fixer. If true, that means this wasn't just a personal letter. It was part of something bigger, a communication passed from the king's office, possibly orchestrated through layers of discretion. The message beneath those initials was short but chilling. Your status was compromised long before the statement. You were warned. This is final. Compromised. That word hung in the air like smoke. What did it mean? Compromised how? Financially? Politically? Personally? Harry reread it, his hands trembling. He whispered the word out loud, like testing its weight. Compromised. Meghan asked what it meant. He didn't answer. He just stared out the window, eyes glassy, voice low. They think I'm a threat, he finally said. To them, the palace, it seemed, had not only cut him off, they had redefined him. Not as a son, not as a prince, but as a liability. And yet, here's where the contradictions deepen. If the letter truly came from the king, why include the secondary note? Why allow such blunt language? Some theorists argue the letter was never meant for Harry at all, that it was part of an internal communication mistakenly leaked or intentionally planted to create emotional damage. After all, Buckingham Palace has mastered one thing better than any royal family in history: control through confusion. Meanwhile, Meghan reportedly made copies of the letter immediately, storing them in a secure digital archive. Her reasoning was clear. If the palace ever denied the correspondence, they would have proof. But this wasn't just about protecting Harry anymore. It was about understanding why. Because if this letter was the trigger, what was the catalyst? What discovery had pushed Charles into making such a final, devastating choice? Insiders close to the royal inner circle began whispering about an investigation, an inquiry quietly commissioned months earlier into the Sussexes' international engagements. It wasn't just about media appearances. It was about security, money, influence. Specifically, the blurred lines between private ventures and royal associations. And according to one courtier's alleged testimony, a confidential report, one never meant to be public, had linked Harry to a potential breach of royal protocol involving third-party entities. Whether that's true or palace spin remains unclear. But to a monarch as cautious as Charles, the mere suggestion was enough to act. Harry, of course, had no idea such a report even existed. Until now, reading that letter, he realized everything had been decided long before his collapse. The statement, the disownment, it was all predetermined. He hadn't been a participant in his own fate. He'd been a bystander. And perhaps that's what broke him more than anything. Not betrayal, but helplessness. Imagine dedicating your life to an institution that turns around and says, "We've reviewed your file, and you're no longer useful." That's not family. That's bureaucracy in a crown. And as Harry sat there, the weight of generations pressing down, one question echoed in his mind. The same question his mother once asked aloud during her own war with the palace. When did we stop being human? Because here's the truth no press release can hide. This wasn't just a royal disagreement. It was history repeating itself. The same machinery that destroyed Diana's peace was now grinding through her son. Meghan, torn between fury and fear, reportedly urged Harry to release the letter publicly, to expose what she called the monarchy's cruelty in handwriting. But Harry refused. Not yet. He said, "I'm not ready to fight them again. Not again." Because deep down, even after everything, a part of him still hoped for reconciliation, still believed that his father's words could be undone. But the letter's final paragraph made that impossible. It ended with a single haunting line. From this point onward, your actions bear no reflection on the crown. The ultimate severance. A statement that said, you're on your own. And if that wasn't enough, the next morning, another package arrived, this time through official courier. It contained Harry's revoked insignias and royal documentation, meticulously catalogued, returned in accordance with administrative procedure. Cold, efficient, heartless. Even the medals he'd earned in service were stripped of their royal insignia, replaced by plain ribbons. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. They were rewriting him out of history. And yet, the most disturbing detail came not from what was inside the package, but what wasn't. Missing from the returned items was one piece, the royal cipher, a small emblem given to every direct descendant of the monarch. Someone, somewhere, had decided Harry didn't deserve even that. Meghan broke down when she saw it. Even his initials, she said quietly. They took even that from him. Outside, the media had no idea. They were still reporting hospital updates, speculating about his next move. But inside Montecito, the reality was far darker. The royal family had officially executed a silent erasure. And while the public debated politics, something else was happening behind palace walls. Because according to a palace aide who later spoke off record, a heated exchange had erupted between Charles and one of his closest advisors just hours before that letter was sent. The king had reportedly shouted, "He is still my son," to which the advisor replied, "Not if you want to save the monarchy. Save the monarchy. At the cost of a son. That's the tragedy of power. It asks for loyalty, but never gives it back." And just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, a new message arrived. Not a letter this time, but a phone call. An anonymous voice. Distorted. Cold. It said only 3 words before hanging up. "You've been warned." No one has ever traced the call. But those who were there say the color drained from Meghan's face when she heard it. Who was warning them? And what were they warning them about? Because what came next would not just shatter Harry's fragile peace. It would drag the monarchy itself into uncharted territory. A revelation hidden deep within royal archives was about to surface. And the person responsible for that leak was not who anyone expected. The palace had tried to erase Harry. But in doing so, they had awoken the one ghost they could never silence, his mother's legacy. And when the next chapter unfolds, that legacy will come roaring back in ways that even the king himself could never control. It was the night before the statement. The wind outside Clarence's house howled like it hadn't in years, rattling the ancient windows, shaking the branches of the trees that had seen monarchs rise and fall. Inside, the lights burned late. King Charles sat alone at his desk, a cup of untouched tea beside a stack of papers he had read so many times they'd begun to blur. His pen rested on a single document. Thick parchment, embossed with the royal seal, the ink glistening faintly under lamplight. It was the official decree, the one that would strip his youngest son of every title, every honor, every tie that once bound him to the crown. He hesitated, not because he doubted the decision, but because he feared what it meant. For the monarchy, for history, for his own soul. They said he had no choice. His advisors, the gray-suited men who whispered of duty and image, had told him this was the only way to preserve the integrity of the throne. The monarchy, they said, could not endure another scandal. Not after the years of turmoil, the headlines, the whispers of deals and leaks. But the truth was far more complicated. Charles wasn't just protecting the institution. He was protecting himself. Because somewhere deep within the confidential briefings, buried under polite phrases like potential reputational harm and security risk, was a name, one that tied directly to his son. A name connected to a financier who had once been flagged by the British government. A name that should never have appeared anywhere near the royal orbit. And yet, there it was, in a leaked email chain linking a Sussex-affiliated charity account. No one accused Harry of wrongdoing. Not officially. But in the world of royal politics, perception is poison. And for Charles, perception had already become reality. Still, as he stared at the decree, the weight of fatherhood pressed against the iron frame of kingship. He remembered holding Harry as a baby, red-faced, squirming, his mother laughing softly beside him. He remembered that night at Balmoral when news came of Diana's crash, how the world blamed him, how his sons clung to him in silence, not understanding what loss really meant. He remembered Harry's wedding day, the smile, the tears, the pride. And now this, a document that would end it all. But Charles wasn't alone that night. As the clock struck midnight, a knock echoed through the study. It was the private secretary, holding a folder. "Your Majesty," he said quietly. "The final draft is ready for signature." Charles looked up. His eyes were tired, older than his years. "Has it been reviewed by the council?" "Yes, sir. All procedures in order." "And the Privy Seal?" "Affixed this morning." Charles nodded. There was no more room for delay. He picked up the pen. But before he could sign, he asked the question that had haunted him all week. "Will this protect the crown?" The advisor hesitated. "It will, sir. But it may destroy the family." For a long moment, neither spoke. But each time, the same response. "We have no official confirmation, Your Majesty." In truth, they did have confirmation, but Renshaw had intercepted it. He feared that a public display of remorse would undermine the decisiveness of the crown. So while Harry lay recovering in California, his father was kept in silence by his own advisor. And that silence changed everything. Because in the absence of empathy, perception filled the void. To the world, Charles appeared unfeeling, vindictive, heartless. The man who crowned himself the modern monarch had become the coldest king of all. It didn't take long for cracks to appear. Royal aides began leaking whispers to the press, some sympathetic, others damning. One claimed the king had broken down privately, muttering, "He's still my boy." Another said he'd grown withdrawn, staring for hours at an old photograph of Harry in uniform. But there was no turning back now. Once the crown acts, it never apologizes. And that's the tragedy of power. It transforms regret into secrecy. Yet beneath all this theater, a darker truth was brewing. Because not everyone inside Buckingham Palace agreed with how the statement had been handled. One low-ranking staffer, believed to have connections to Harry's former office, quietly copied a confidential memo from Renshaw's files. That memo detailed the chain of communication leading to the decree and revealed that a private investigation had indeed been conducted on Harry, with findings that were never shared with him. Even worse, it showed that the king had been given selective information. Crucial details were omitted, manipulated, or exaggerated. In other words, Charles had been played. Whether by advisors, by political pressure, or by his own fear, he had been maneuvered into doing the unthinkable. And the architect behind it all, the man whose signature approved the final press draft, was none other than Clive A. Renshaw. The same initials found in that envelope. The same shadow now pulling royal strings. Which raises a question: was the king's final decision ever truly his own? Or was he just another pawn in the monarchy's endless game of preservation? As dawn broke over London the next morning, Charles stood at the window of his private quarters. The city was waking, the newspapers already printing the headline he had dreaded. King Charles disowns his son. He closed his eyes. Outside, Big Ben struck 6. Somewhere across the ocean, his son was waking in a hospital bed. 2 men, 2 worlds, 1 crown between them. And as the king turned away from the window, one of his aides whispered the question that would echo through the halls for weeks. "What now, sir?" Charles didn't answer. He simply stared at the empty chair across from him, the one Harry used to sit in when he visited, and said softly, "We wait." But waiting would not save him, because what came next was not patience. It was exposure. A leak inside the palace was about to send shockwaves through the monarchy, revealing exactly who had manipulated the king and why. And the revelation waiting to break would not only threaten his reign, it would make the world question everything they thought they knew about the royal family. Because the king's final decision wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the monarchy's biggest reckoning in decades. And the first crack was about to appear. It was morning in Montecito when the world turned on its head. The air was still, heavy with coastal mist, the kind that makes sound travel slowly, like the world is holding its breath. Inside the Sussex estate, Meghan Markle sat at the edge of their long, oak dining table, her phone buzzing endlessly. Dozens of alerts, hundreds of mentions, thousands of comments. The royal statement had gone global overnight. Every outlet, BBC, CNN, Sky News, TMZ, was replaying the same headline in bold letters. King Charles strips Prince Harry of all titles. For most people, it was breaking news. For Meghan, it was a nightmare on repeat. She stared at the screen, reading the line again and again, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into a misunderstanding. But they didn't. They were final, permanent, brutal. A few feet away, Harry was silent, still pale from his collapse days earlier. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since waking up in the hospital. The doctors had called it exhaustion. But Meghan knew better. This wasn't physical. It was emotional, soul deep. She reached for his hand, but he didn't move. "Harry," she said softly, "we have to say something." He didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window, eyes fixed on the ocean, lost somewhere in the distance. The silence between them was deafening. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Because if Harry wouldn't fight back, she would. For Meghan, silence was never safety. It was surrender. And she refused to surrender again. Not to the monarchy. Not to the press. Not to the ghosts that had driven his mother to her grave. Within hours, she was on the phone with their PR team, demanding a full statement. But the advisors hesitated. Meghan, one of them warned, "If you go against the palace right now, they'll retaliate." This could get ugly. Her voice sharpened. They already made it ugly. The room fell silent. She continued, "I won't let them erase him. Not again." And with that, she began drafting her own response. A counterstatement meant to reclaim control. It wouldn't be emotional. It would be strategic. Because Meghan understood media warfare better than anyone. She had learned it the hard way. She'd seen how headlines twisted truth into fiction, how silence was painted as guilt, how grief was turned into performance. She had endured it all before, and this time, she wasn't playing defense. But even as she typed the first words, she stopped. Something inside her hesitated. Because this wasn't just about PR, it was about survival. Every decision, every word she released would carry consequences. Not just for her, but for Harry's fragile recovery. And yet, how could she stay quiet while the world treated her husband like a traitor? She looked back at him, still staring out at the ocean. "Do you want me to say something?" she asked quietly. Harry blinked, slowly. "Do what you think is right." It was permission, but it sounded like surrender. That was enough. She opened her laptop and began to write. The opening line was sharp, deliberate, and defiant. A father's crown should never come before his son's heart. Those words alone would later set the internet ablaze. But before the statement could go live, Meghan received a call. A number she didn't recognize, but the prefix made her pause. UK country code. She answered. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was calm, composed, unmistakably British. "This is a courtesy call from the palace press office," the woman said. "We understand you are preparing a response. We strongly advise against it." Meghan's grip tightened. "Advise against what? Defending my husband?" "There are matters you may not be aware of," the voice replied. "Sensitive information that could be unfavorable if public confrontation continues." It was a threat wrapped in politeness. The old royal way. Meghan didn't flinch. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all, ma'am. Merely a friendly reminder. The monarchy always protects its own." Then the line went dead. Meghan stared at the phone, pulse racing. They were scared. That call wasn't about diplomacy. It was damage control. Someone inside the palace knew she was about to expose something they couldn't afford to let out. And yet, instead of deterring her, it fueled her. She sent the statement live minutes later. It hit social media like a bomb. Within half an hour, #StandWithHarry was trending worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and activists began reposting her message with their own takes. Oprah shared it with a caption, "Truth doesn't need titles." Serena Williams commented a heart emoji. Even Elton John, who'd once been close to the royal family, posted a cryptic line from one of his songs, "It's lonely out in space." The support was overwhelming. But behind the cheers came the backlash. British tabloids went into full attack mode. "Meghan declares war on the crown," one headline read. Another called her the Duchess of Defiance. And within hours, Buckingham Palace released its countermeasure, a cold, calculated line of denial. The king's decision is final. The crown will not be drawn into public commentary. Classic, dismissive, authoritative. But this time, Meghan was ready. She appeared that evening on a private video call with a handful of close allies, media strategists, friends, and a few influential figures from the U.S. press circuit. The call lasted 3 hours. By the end, A plan had formed to tell their side of the story, not through gossip or leaks, but through a documentary, a project already in quiet development before the scandal exploded. Except now, the stakes had changed. What was once a feel-good narrative about life beyond the palace had evolved into something darker, an exposé about royal power, manipulation, and the cost of truth. Insiders later said that after the call, Meghan turned to Harry and said, "They took everything, so let's take their illusion." But even as she prepared to fight, cracks began forming in the background, because the palace wasn't the only one watching. According to U.S. intelligence contacts familiar with royal security coordination, a transmission breach had been logged between Montecito and several London-based networks, meaning someone inside the Sussex circle might have been feeding information back to the palace. In other words, Meghan's war room wasn't as private as she believed. And the more she planned, the more desperate the tone became. Emails, text threads, meeting notes. All reflected a woman oscillating between fury and fear. At times, she was fiery, determined to expose the truth. Other times, she was haunted by paranoia, convinced the walls were listening. Because maybe they were. Meanwhile, Harry was deteriorating. He'd stopped reading the news, stopped eating full meals. When Meghan mentioned the letter, the one from his father, he asked her to burn it. She didn't. She hid it. One evening, as twilight fell over Montecito, Harry finally spoke. His voice was quiet, distant. "They win if we fight back," he said. "That's what they want. To make us look unhinged." Meghan's reply was sharp. "They win if we stay silent." It was the oldest conflict in their marriage, duty versus defiance. He wanted peace. She wanted justice. And both were losing. The next day, a new twist hit the headlines. A British journalist, known for his royal exclusives, claimed to have evidence that Meghan herself had leaked confidential messages to influence the narrative during the early stages of their departure from royal duties. The timing couldn't have been worse. She immediately denied it, calling it a deliberate smear to distract from the king's actions. But the damage was done. Every outlet picked it up. Every thread of her credibility was questioned again. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Harry's doctor issued a stark warning. If he doesn't disengage soon, the stress could cause a relapse. That night, Meghan sat beside him as he slept, scrolling through the headlines in the dim light of her phone. Unfit for royal life. Duchess in denial. Palace sources questioned Meghan's mental stability. She turned off the phone, tears burning her eyes. Defiance had turned into desperation. Because no matter how loud she shouted, the monarchy's silence drowned her out. And that's when she realized the battle wasn't public. It was psychological. The monarchy didn't fight wars on social media. They fought through perception, patience, and quiet destruction. By the end of that week, Meghan withdrew from public view entirely. No interviews, no posts, no statements. To the outside world, it looked like defeat. But inside those walls, something else was brewing. Because during her silence, a contact from London reached out. A woman claiming to be a former palace staffer who had something Meghan needed to see. An email attachment arrived the next morning. A scanned document bearing the official insignia of the Royal Communications Office. Its title, Operation Perseus, Strategic Reputation Management Plan. And under it, one chilling subheading. Stage 3, Controlled Discreditation of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Meghan read every line, her heart pounding. It was a roadmap, detailing how leaks, rumors, and narrative shifts were orchestrated to erode their credibility, all while maintaining plausible deniability for the palace. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof. She printed the file, locked it in a drawer, and said to herself, they wanted a war. But what she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this discovery would soon be traced. Someone at Buckingham Palace realized the file had been copied, and the moment they did, a quiet order went out across royal security networks. Find the source. Contain the leak. Because the revelation Meghan had just uncovered wasn't only about reputation. It linked to something even more dangerous, a hidden network of influence tied directly to the king's senior advisor, Clive A. Renshaw. And that connection would soon shatter the myth of royal unity once and for all. The storm had only begun, and in the eye of it stood a woman who refused to bow, no matter how hard the crown tried to silence her. But as the next revelation surfaced, it wouldn't be Meghan the palace tried to stop. it would be Harry himself. It was just past 2 a.m. in Montecito when the phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence of the house like a blade. Megan jolted awake. Harry didn't move. He'd been drifting in and out of uneasy sleep for days, half medicated, half haunted. But something about that ring felt different. Urgent. Heavy. The screen lit up. Unknown caller. United Kingdom. Her heart stopped. She glanced at Harry. "Should I answer?" she whispered. He stirred, his eyes barely opening. Who would call this late? The phone rang again. He took it, hesitating just long enough to make it hurt. "Hello." There was a pause, a long, deliberate silence, filled with static and distance. Then came a voice he hadn't heard in months. "Harry." That tone, firm, clipped, unmistakable. The voice of a king, but also, once, of a father. "Father," Harry breathed. "Yes, it's me." For a moment, neither spoke. It was as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for one of them to blink. Finally, Harry broke the silence. "You waited until now to call me?" His voice trembled, not with fear, but disbelief. Charles exhaled, slow, heavy. "I was told you were recovering. I thought it best not to disturb you." "Not disturb me?" Harry said bitterly. "You erased me." The line crackled. Somewhere in London, the king was alone in his private study, lit only by a single lamp. Behind him, the portrait of Queen Elizabeth seemed to stare down in silent judgment. "I did what had to be done," Charles said quietly. "You left me no choice." Harry laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounds more like breaking glass. "No choice? You had 1,000 choices. You chose this." Charles didn't respond right away. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head, but none of the words felt right now that his son was actually on the other end. "Do you know what it means?" he began slowly. "To carry the weight of a kingdom? Every move watched, every silence judged." Harry cut him off. "You think I don't know what that's like? I lived it, father. Every glare, every lie, every time they used us as distraction pieces. You think I didn't feel that same weight-crushing, Mom?" The mention of Diana made Charles stiffen. The line went quiet again, the sound of air filling the void. "She was loved," he said finally. "She was destroyed," Harry snapped. "And you're doing it again, this time to your own son." There it was. The old wound, torn open again. Charles's hand trembled as he rubbed his temple. "You must understand, Harry, this is not personal. It's protocol." "Protocol?" Harry's voice cracked. "I'm not a policy. I'm your child." The emotion in his tone cut through even the king's well-trained composure. For a second, Charles wasn't the monarch of the United Kingdom. He was just a father drowning in the consequences of his own restraint. "I didn't want it this way," he said softly. "Then why did you sign it?" No answer. "Because someone told you to?" Harry pressed. "Because your advisors said I was a liability? Because Clive Renshaw whispered in your ear that your own son was dangerous?" The mention of Renshaw's name changed everything. Charles straightened in his chair. "How do you know that name?" "I know enough," Harry replied. "Enough to see that the same man who's been poisoning this family for years convinced you to cut me out completely." The king's silence was confirmation. "Harry," Charles began carefully, "there are things at play that you don't understand." "Then make me understand," Harry fired back. "For once in your life, tell me the truth." Charles hesitated. The truth. That word meant different things to each of them. For the king, truth was what protected the institution. For Harry, truth was what tore it down. "Certain information came to me," Charles said finally, "regarding your activities abroad. I was told it posed a potential threat to the integrity of the crown." Harry blinked, stunned. "A threat? From what? Charity work? From helping veterans?" "That's not what I was told," the king said quietly. "There were claims, unverified, but persistent, of sensitive exchanges involving private documents." "Private documents?" Harry repeated, his anger rising. "That's ridiculous. They're lying to you. They've been lying to you for years." "Perhaps," Charles said, "but perception can destroy as swiftly as truth." "And you let them convince you I was the enemy," Harry said, voice shaking. "Just like they convinced you Mum was unstable." Charles closed his eyes. "That's not fair. It's not supposed to be fair," Harry shouted. "It's supposed to be honest." The outburst hung between them like thunder. Then, softer, Harry said, "Do you even know what that statement did to me?" Charles's voice dropped. "I heard you collapsed." "You heard?" Harry's tone sharpened. "That's it. Not I was worried. Not I called. Just, you heard. I wanted to call, Charles said weakly. I was told not to. By who? A pause. Renshaw. There it was. The puppet master's name again. Harry laughed bitterly. So the man who told you to erase me also told you to ignore me. Convenient. Harry, Charles said, his tone weary now. You don't understand what's at stake. No, Harry said, his voice breaking. You don't understand what you've lost. The silence after that felt infinite. Then, Charles whispered something unexpected. You remind me of her. Harry froze. Of who? Your mother. The words hit like lightning. Charles continued, his voice trembling. She was fire, beautiful, impossible, defiant. She couldn't bend to the rules either. And I didn't know how to protect her. I thought distance would save her. I was wrong. Harry swallowed hard. You're wrong again, he said. Distance doesn't save anyone. It just kills them slower. The king said nothing. His breathing was uneven, his voice thin. I've carried this family for 50 years, Charles whispered. And every time I try to hold it together, it slips through my fingers. Because you're holding it too tight, Harry said. The silence stretched again. The only sound was static and two men fighting ghosts through a phone line. Finally, Harry said softly, tell me this wasn't about control. Tell me it wasn't about showing me who still has the power. Charles's response was quiet. Sometimes power is all that's left. And with that, something in Harry broke again. Not with anger this time, but sadness. You sound just like them, he said. Just like the ones who convinced you she was the problem. You've become what you always swore you'd never be. The king's voice faltered. And what's that? A ruler without love. It was the kind of line that could end a conversation, or a relationship. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then came a sound Harry had never heard from him before. Not authority, not command, just a quiet, fractured whisper. I don't know how to fix this, Charles said. Tell me how. Harry closed his eyes. Start by remembering I'm not one of your subjects. Then he hung up. The call ended. The silence returned. Across the ocean, in Clarence House, the king sat frozen, the phone still in his hand. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward the portrait of Diana again. She would have hated me for this, he murmured. Meanwhile, in Montecito, Meghan stood in the doorway, watching as Harry sat motionless, staring at the darkened screen of his phone. What did he say? She asked quietly. Harry didn't answer right away. Then, without looking up, he said, he's not the one in charge anymore. Meghan frowned. What do you mean? Harry's eyes met hers. The man who runs the monarchy isn't wearing the crown. That was the moment everything changed. Because from that night on, the Sussexes stopped treating this as a family feud. It was war, and the next step would take them into territory even the monarchy feared. Proof that the man behind their suffering wasn't just an advisor. He was something far more powerful. But exposing him would come at a price neither Harry nor Meghan could imagine. Because Clive Renshaw's reach didn't end at Buckingham Palace. It stretched into governments, corporations, media empires. And as Harry's midnight call faded into memory, a new operation had already begun, one designed not to silence him, but to destroy him publicly, completely, and forever. The machine of the monarchy was awakening. And this time, it wasn't playing defense. By dawn, London was already spinning. What began as whispers in palace corridors became a full-blown media wildfire before the king had even finished his morning tea. The leak of the midnight call was out. No one knew how. No one admitted who. But somewhere between Montecito and Westminster, fragments of that private conversation had been recorded, pieced together, and delivered neatly to a handful of trusted reporters. The king tried to reach out, but the duke rejected reconciliation. That was the line. Simple, sharp, reversible. It painted Charles as the grieving father, Harry as the petulant son. Within hours, every headline echoed the same refrain. Palace sources, the king heartbroken but resolute. Royal PR had gone into overdrive. At Clarence House, the communications war room buzzed like a beehive. Screens flickered with live coverage, social media feeds scrolled endlessly, and at the center of it all stood Clive A. Renshaw, the man Harry had named the night before. He was calm, almost surgical, as he orchestrated the cleanup. Control the sympathy, he said flatly to his team. We don't silence him, we drown him. That was his genius. Renshaw never fought scandal with denial. He fought it with noise. Flood the airwaves. Fill every front page. Feed the beast until no one remembers what they were angry about. His first move was brilliant in its cruelty. A short, carefully worded statement was sent to the BBC. His Majesty remains deeply saddened by the continuing distance between himself and the Duke. He hopes one day his son will find peace. 5 sentences that made the king sound saintly. 5 sentences that turned Harry's pain into petulance. And it worked. By noon, British talk shows were flooded with royal commentators nodding solemnly about the king's compassion in the face of rejection. Tabloids printed side-by-side photos. Charles looking weary but dignified. Harry looking wild-eyed, unshaven, unsteady. Optics, not truth. That's how reputations live or die in the palace. Meanwhile, in California, Meghan watched the coverage in stunned disbelief. "They're rewriting the call," she said, pacing the living room. "They're twisting it before the ink is even dry." Harry said nothing. He'd seen this before. He knew how fast the palace could turn sympathy into suspicion. "It's not over," he murmured. "They'll push harder." He was right. By the end of the day, a new wave of articles emerged, each sourced to unnamed insiders. Palace staff concerned for Harry's mental health. Advisors say Duke's judgment clouded by emotion. King forced to act after repeated breaches of trust. None of it verifiable, all of it effective. Because that's how Renshaw's system worked. Seed a story, let the tabloids water it. Watch public opinion bloom in your favor. And yet, as the machine roared, small cracks began to show. A few veteran reporters, old-school correspondents who'd covered the royals for decades, noticed something odd. Every headline used the same phrasing, the same adjectives, the same cadence. It didn't look like coincidence. It looked like coordination. One of them, a senior editor at The Guardian, quietly reached out to a contact inside the palace. "Is Renshaw behind this?" he asked. The answer came back in a single word: always. But while Renshaw played chess with the press, something unexpected was brewing behind his back. A junior aide, new to the royal communications team, had begun recording internal briefings. He claimed it was for accuracy. In truth, he'd grown uneasy watching how facts were twisted. Those recordings, barely 2 days old, would soon find their way to a journalist in Los Angeles, and eventually, to Meghan's inbox. For now, though, the storm raged unchecked. Television pundits dissected every syllable of the king's tone. Body language experts debated whether Harry's posture in paparazzi photos suggested guilt. Royal historians were wheeled out to discuss precedents for disinheritance. It was theater, grand, relentless, exhausting. And in the middle of it, Harry and Meghan became characters in someone else's script. "We need to respond," Meghan said. Harry shook his head. "Every word we say feeds them." She turned to him, eyes fierce. "Then they win." He looked away. "They already have." That sentence broke something in her. The next morning, the couple's team received a polite but chilling email from a London PR firm. "Our monitoring systems indicate a coordinated narrative shift unfavorable to your client. We recommend strategic silence for 72 hours to allow sentiment to stabilize." Strategic silence. A fancy way of saying, keep quiet while they bury you. But while the Sussexes hid, Renshaw's campaign evolved. He arranged a chance photo of Charles leaving a cathedral service, stoic, solemn, clutching his prayer book. The caption? "A father prays for reconciliation." Behind the scenes, he fed select journalists with off-record briefings implying that Harry's outburst had caused distress to the Queen consort. Cue another round of sympathetic coverage. Camilla, the misunderstood stepmother, bearing the brunt of her husband's wayward son. It was brilliant storytelling and utterly fabricated. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, social media began to fracture. For every hashtag Stand With Harry post, there were 10 claiming he was unstable, ungrateful, or unhinged. Influencers picked sides. Late-night hosts made jokes. The algorithm did the rest. By week's end, polls showed public favor swinging sharply back toward the monarchy. Renshaw had done it again. But not everyone in the palace was celebrating. Princess Anne was furious. According to an insider, she confronted Renshaw in the corridor outside the king's private study. "You're turning this family into a circus," she snapped. Renshaw smiled coolly. "Better a circus than a scandal, ma'am," and glared at him. "Scandals pass. Betrayal doesn't." She stormed out. He didn't care, because by then, Renshaw's plan had entered phase 2, distraction. The same weekend, the palace quietly leaked an unrelated story, a charity initiative spearheaded by Prince William and Catherine. Perfect timing. Smiling photos of the future king and queen filled the news cycle, pushing Harry's saga further down the feed. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Yet beneath the calm surface, something dangerous was bubbling. The recordings made by that junior aide were now in transit, encrypted, anonymous, and labeled Renshaw files. In them, Renshaw could be heard instructing staff to weaponize compassion, to control the optics of guilt, and most damningly, to ensure no communication between the king and the duke occurs without mediation. If those recordings went public, the monarchy's carefully curated image would implode. But before Meghan could even open the email containing the files, an unexpected visitor arrived at their doorstep. A courier, unmarked vehicle, no signature required. Inside the envelope he delivered was a single sheet of paper. No header, no logo, just one typed line. Do not release what you've been sent. For your children's sake. No name, no contact, no clue how they knew. Meghan froze. Harry took the note from her hands, reading it twice. This is how they work, he said quietly. Not threats, warnings. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a candlelit office in London, Clive Renshaw poured himself a glass of whiskey and smiled at the evening news. The anchors were praising the king's strength, the monarchy's stability, the nation's pride. Another crisis contained, he murmured. He didn't know, yet, that the recordings were already in motion.